40 engineers. That was roughly the size of the team that helped transform one of China's most ambitious semiconductor projects from a collection of expensive buildings into an actual manufacturing operation. For years, Washington treated advanced chips as if they were ancient treasure maps. Protect the designs, restrict the equipment, tighten export controls, investigate industrial espionage, build thicker walls around the technology. But semiconductor manufacturing was never just about blueprints. A chip design sitting on a server is useless without thousands of tiny decisions made by experienced engineers who have spent years solving problems that never appear in textbooks. How do you improve yields when one production batch suddenly drops by 3%? Why does a specific deposition tool behave differently during humid months? Which process step causes microscopic defects that only become visible weeks later? Those answers don't live inside patents. They live inside people, and people have salaries. That may sound almost too simple for a technology race worth hundreds of billions of dollars, but it explains something many observers still struggle to understand. China didn't suddenly wake up one morning knowing how to manufacture advanced semiconductors. It acquired expertise the same way elite football clubs buy talent from rivals. It offered opportunities, resources, and in many cases, compensation packages that engineers simply couldn't ignore. That matters because semiconductors aren't some distant geopolitical hobby. They determine the price of your smartphone, the availability of graphics cards, the cost of electric vehicles, and increasingly, who dominates artificial intelligence. If one country becomes the preferred destination for technical talent, the balance shifts far beyond electronics. There's another uncomfortable detail. America's semiconductor industry has been warning about labor shortages for years. According to projections from the Semiconductor Industry Association and Oxford Economics, the United States could face a shortage of tens of thousands of skilled chip workers by the end of this decade. At precisely the moment when experience became most valuable, many engineers discovered that staying loyal didn't necessarily pay. We'll come back to that. Because before discussing China, it's worth asking a question. Was there really a massive campaign to steal semiconductor secrets? Certainly, there were espionage cases. Some individuals illegally transferred trade secrets, and several companies faced accusations involving intellectual property violations. Ignoring that would be dishonest. But focusing only on espionage creates a strangely incomplete picture. Imagine spending 20 years mastering a highly specialized process at a fabrication plant. You understand the equipment better than its manufacturer. You've survived production disasters, supply shortages, and impossible deadlines. Then another company calls. It offers double your compensation, a larger research budget, a senior leadership position, and the chance to build something from scratch instead of maintaining a mature production line. What exactly are we expecting people to do? Decline because of patriotism? Some undoubtedly did. Others didn't. And that's not unique to semiconductors. Silicon Valley has spent decades recruiting scientists from Europe, India, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Nobody accused American companies of stealing talent when they hired foreign engineers. It was called competition. Apparently, competition becomes suspicious when someone else wins. One former executive described the situation bluntly. Semiconductor expertise resembles a craft guild more than an ordinary profession. New graduates can learn theory quickly, but manufacturing knowledge accumulates through years of mistakes. You can't compress 10 years of experience into a 6-month training program. Money, however, can persuade someone carrying those 10 years to move. By the late 2000s, Chinese firms, provincial governments, and investment funds had already started pursuing exactly that strategy. Some offers reportedly included housing benefits, relocation packages, research funding, and salaries that exceeded what many engineers were earning in established American facilities. There was even a dry irony hidden inside the process. Washington spent years debating whether China was stealing secrets. China quietly asked a different question. What if the secrets arrived on commercial flights carrying engineers who had simply accepted better jobs? And once that possibility enters the conversation, the story becomes much less about spies and much more about incentives. Because one engineer leaving is an employee problem. 40 engineers leaving begins to look like an industrial policy. And that's where the real story starts. The engineer shortage problem didn't appear overnight. It was built gradually, almost invisibly, over 3 decades. Beginning in the 1990s, much of America's semiconductor manufacturing capacity moved overseas. Companies discovered they could design chips in California while producing them in Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, or Malaysia at lower cost. Wall Street loved the arrangement. Margins improved, quarterly reports looked healthier. Manufacturing experience, however, doesn't survive inside spreadsheets. Every fabrication plant that closes stops training future specialists. Every production line moved abroad reduces the number of engineers learning how to solve real-world manufacturing problems. By the mid-2000s, the United States still dominated chip design. Companies such as NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, and Apple were producing some of the most sophisticated architectures ever created. Yet many of the people who knew how to run high-volume cutting-edge fabs worked elsewhere. China noticed. And unlike many governments that announce grand industrial plans and then disappear into bureaucracy, Beijing committed serious money. In 2014, the Chinese government launched what became known as the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, often called the Big Fund. Its first phase mobilized roughly 138 billion yuan. The second phase, announced in 2019, added another 204 billion yuan. That wasn't charity, it was a shopping budget. SMIC expanded aggressively. YMTC recruited experienced NAND flash specialists. CXMT pursued memory engineers. Provincial governments competed with one another to attract semiconductor projects, sometimes behaving like wealthy football club owners trying to sign star players before the transfer window closed. One dry observation almost writes itself. Countries usually compete for oil fields. The 21st century version involves arguing over process integration managers, and sometimes the recruitment campaigns were remarkably targeted. Taiwan became one of the most important hunting grounds. This wasn't because Taiwanese engineers lacked loyalty. It was because Taiwan possessed something almost nobody else had at scale: decades of accumulated manufacturing expertise. An engineer who spent 15 years at a leading fab had seen equipment failures, contamination incidents, supply disruptions, and yield optimization battles. Hiring that person meant importing years of institutional memory. Reports from Taiwan suggested some Chinese firms offered compensation packages 2 or even 3 times higher than local salaries. Not everyone accepted, but enough people did. And once a few senior employees move, they often bring former colleagues into the new company. Networks matter. Semiconductor manufacturing depends heavily on trust. Managers prefer working with engineers whose abilities they've already witnessed under pressure. Remember the number from the opening? 40 engineers. Cases like that began appearing repeatedly. Sometimes teams moved together. Sometimes they departed gradually over several years. Occasionally, regulators intervened. But preventing movement entirely proved difficult because most of these people weren't stealing blueprints hidden inside briefcases. They were carrying experience inside their heads. America faced another complication: immigration policy. For decades, the United States benefited enormously from attracting global scientific talent. Graduate students arrived from India, China, South Korea, and Europe. Many remained, founded companies, conducted research, and strengthened entire industries. Then, political debates became increasingly hostile towards skilled immigration. Visa uncertainty grew. Green card waiting periods stretched. Students graduating from top engineering programs started asking practical questions. Should they remain in America hoping paperwork eventually clears? Or should they accept offers elsewhere immediately? Talent rarely enjoys waiting. People often frame semiconductor competition as a battle between governments. I think that's incomplete. Governments provide incentives. Companies write contracts. Individuals make calculations at kitchen tables. A 38-year-old engineer with 2 children doesn't necessarily think about geopolitical rivalry before accepting a better offer. He thinks about mortgage payments, education costs, whether he'll spend another decade stuck in middle management. Critics argue that Chinese subsidies distort markets. They're not entirely wrong. State-backed funding certainly altered the landscape, but subsidies alone don't explain why experienced professionals leave. Money attracts attention. Respect keeps people. And in several cases, engineers who relocated said they were promised something equally valuable: influence. Instead of maintaining mature technologies, they could lead entire divisions, shape manufacturing strategies, and build facilities almost from the ground up. For ambitious specialists, that can matter more than salary. This creates a dilemma for Washington. Export controls can restrict machines. Trade barriers can slow supply chains. Investigations can punish illegal transfers. None of those tools easily prevent someone from signing an employment contract, especially when the competing offer feels less like poaching and more like recognition. Which leads to a more difficult question. What if China's biggest semiconductor advantage wasn't government planning? What if it was simply understanding that highly skilled people eventually go wherever they feel most valued? Because the answer to that question changes who deserves blame and who doesn't. There's a counter-argument worth taking seriously. Many American officials would say this discussion understates the role of intellectual property theft. They would point to court cases, Department of Justice indictments, and reports describing attempts to obtain restricted technologies through improper channels. Some of those cases were real. Some resulted in convictions. And advanced semiconductor manufacturing absolutely contains proprietary knowledge that companies spend decades developing. But here's where the story becomes awkward. Even if every espionage incident disappeared tomorrow, China's semiconductor industry would still be considerably stronger today than it was 10 years ago, because the foundation was already being built. Take SMIC. For years, analysts assumed Chinese foundries would remain permanently stuck several generations behind industry leaders. Export controls were supposed to reinforce that gap. Then, in 2023, analysts examining processors inside Huawei's Mate 60 Pro found evidence suggesting production using a 7-nanometer class process. That surprised a lot of people. Not because 7 nanometers is the global frontier anymore, it isn't. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and Samsung had already moved beyond that. The surprise came from timing. Washington had restricted access to advanced lithography equipment. American policymakers expected those measures to buy years of breathing room. Instead, China demonstrated that technological progress can continue even under pressure, although usually at higher cost and lower efficiency. That doesn't mean sanctions failed completely. They certainly increased expenses. Yield rates likely suffered. Production volumes remained limited. Yet sanctions alone couldn't erase the accumulated expertise already inside Chinese companies. And that brings us back to the engineer sitting at a kitchen table, deciding whether to accept a new offer. Once enough experienced people arrive, something interesting happens. Knowledge stops being imported. It starts reproducing itself. Senior engineers train junior engineers. Junior engineers become managers. Managers establish internal procedures. Mistakes happen. People learn. The industry develops its own memory. At that stage, restricting individual talent flows matters much less, because the ecosystem begins generating replacements. Think about the American aerospace industry during the 20th century. The United States didn't dominate aviation because it recruited a few brilliant foreigners. It dominated because thousands of engineers trained tens of thousands more. Competence became self-sustaining. China appears determined to achieve the same effect in semiconductors. Universities expanded microelectronics programs. Research institutes increased enrollment. Companies created partnerships with academic departments. By 2024, China was producing hundreds of thousands of engineering graduates annually in fields connected to electronics and manufacturing. Quantity alone doesn't equal quality. That's true. Many graduates still require years of practical experience, but an abundant pipeline changes the equation. If even a small percentage become world-class specialists, the absolute number becomes significant. Here's the reversal that shifted my own perspective. I initially assumed this was mainly a story about China becoming stronger. I'm no longer convinced. It may be more accurately described as America becoming less attractive. Those aren't identical things. A country can remain technologically advanced while simultaneously making itself harder to work in. Housing costs rise, healthcare expenses increase, immigration becomes uncertain, manufacturing jobs disappear. Experienced engineers retire faster than replacements arrive. Eventually, another nation doesn't need to outperform you dramatically. It only needs to look slightly more appealing. History offers uncomfortable examples. Britain led industrial manufacturing during the 19th century. It remained wealthy for decades afterward. But leadership gradually shifted elsewhere because competitors adopted existing knowledge and invested heavily in expanding production capacity. Nobody woke up one morning announcing Britain's industrial era had ended. People only recognized the transition years later. I'm not claiming America faces inevitable decline, far from it. The United States still possesses extraordinary advantages. Its universities remain among the best in the world. Its chip designers dominate entire sectors. Its venture capital ecosystem remains difficult to replicate. And the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 represents a serious attempt to rebuild domestic manufacturing. The question is whether rebuilding factories automatically rebuilds experience. Factories can be constructed within 3 years. Communities of experts often take 20. We'll find out soon enough. Because if Washington keeps assuming that semiconductor competition is mainly about protecting secrets, it may spend billions defending information while overlooking the people capable of creating the next generation of it. And countries that understand human incentives tend to win longer races than countries that only understand restrictions. Remember those 40 engineers from the beginning? In some ways, they never mattered. And in another sense, they mattered enormously. Because they symbolized a larger shift taking place beneath headlines about sanctions, espionage, and national security. Semiconductor competition stopped being primarily a contest over machines years ago. It became a contest over where highly skilled people want to spend the next 15 years of their lives. America seems to be recognizing that reality. Companies are investing again. Intel is expanding manufacturing projects in Ohio. TSMC is building facilities in Arizona. Micron announced major memory investments in New York. Federal subsidies are flowing back into domestic production through the CHIPS Act. Those developments are meaningful, but they also reveal how expensive neglect can become. The United States is spending tens of billions of dollars trying to recreate capabilities that once existed naturally. China, meanwhile, spent years purchasing expertise one employment contract at a time. That's considerably cheaper, and perhaps more effective. I don't think China ever believed it could instantly surpass Taiwan, South Korea, or the United States. Its objective appears more modest and more practical. Reduce dependence, close the gap, become good enough that external pressure loses its ability to cause panic. Viewed through that lens, recent Chinese progress makes more sense. Even if Chinese fabs remain less efficient than industry leaders, producing 80% of what you need domestically is very different from producing 20%. Resilience matters, especially when geopolitical tensions are rising. Of course, there are limits. China still lacks access to extreme ultraviolet lithography systems produced by ASML. Leading-edge manufacturing remains extraordinarily difficult. Some Chinese semiconductor projects collapsed after receiving huge investments and failing to deliver results. Money can hire expertise. Money cannot repeal physics. And there is another challenge rarely discussed. Engineers don't remain motivated forever. People eventually ask themselves whether they're building something meaningful or merely responding to government targets. Innovation thrives in environments where individuals can experiment, fail, disagree with managers, and occasionally ignore conventional wisdom. I'm not entirely certain China has solved that cultural problem yet. The data leans toward improvement, but the verdict isn't final. At the same time, America shouldn't assume its traditional advantages are permanent. Prestige alone doesn't pay tuition bills. Patriotism doesn't reduce housing costs. National pride doesn't shorten visa backlogs. Highly trained specialists often behave exactly like everyone else. They compare opportunities. They think about family. They wonder whether their work will matter. Then they choose. And that's probably my biggest takeaway from this entire story. Governments like to imagine technological leadership as a fortress, build walls, guard the gates, inspect everyone entering. Semiconductors don't really work that way. They're more like ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems attract talent naturally. Weak ecosystems slowly lose it. The irony is difficult to ignore. For years, political debates treated semiconductor expertise almost as classified information. Yet some of the most valuable knowledge in the industry changed countries without being hidden at all. It traveled in business class. It attended meetings. It collected signing bonuses. And it introduced itself to new colleagues on Monday mornings. So did China need to steal semiconductor secrets? Probably not. It found a simpler approach: offer experienced people better pay, larger ambitions, and a chance to build an industry that believed it was still climbing upward. Enough accepted, enough stayed, enough trained others, and eventually the conversation shifted from whether China could make advanced chips to how quickly it might improve the ones it already makes. My prediction is fairly straightforward. Within the next decade, China probably won't dominate the absolute cutting edge of semiconductor manufacturing, but I suspect it won't need to. It will likely become sufficiently capable in enough categories that sanctions lose much of their leverage. America can still prevent that outcome, not by building higher fences, by making sure the smartest engineers on Earth continue looking at the United States and thinking, that's where I want to spend my career. Because once people stop thinking that, the most sophisticated machines in the world become expensive buildings waiting for someone else to operate them. If you enjoyed spending these few minutes thinking through the problem with me, stick around. There's no shortage of strange decisions shaping the future, and semiconductors may only be the beginning. As it turns out, silicon remembers who invested in it. People remember who invested in them,